Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation, this time on using our Express middleware. Now, unfortunately, this will be the first, I believe, recitation not recorded live. I have a doctor's appointment to attend during the normal lunch hour when I would do this, so I am dropping this pre-made video for each of you. I think there is a lot to be said for the live format, but hopefully this will make do for now. So our goal here is to write out a basic API for users and posts and implement some middleware at various points in this API to perform various actions that we would want to do. So we have here a list of the middleware that we want to implement, a logger, and functions to validate user IDs, to validate the user, and to validate the post. And we're going to be writing these out as soon as we get our server set up. So I already have my project installed and I have the server running. We can take a look inside of our index.js, which is going to be our entry point to the project, and notice that it is empty. However, if we look inside of our server.js, we'll see that we already have a little bit started here. We're going to need to have this require express, but we already have the server defined. We have this basic endpoint set up, and we also have some scaffolding throughout this project of where we're going to need to write and apply certain functions. But let's get our server listening. So I'm going to go back into index.js. I am going to require our server. And then I'm going to call server.listen on port, let's do 6000 this time. And we'll console.log server on port 6000. There we go. So now we have a server listening. And we can verify that we've hooked that up correctly by testing this dummy endpoint here. On our root, I already have Insomnia going. Might as well make a new workspace for this, and we will make a GET request to localhost 6000 and to the root. And we see, let's write some middleware. Alright, we're ready to get started. The first piece of middleware we want to write is this global middleware logger. We want to, on all requests made to the server, log some various pieces of information. The request method, the request URL, and a timestamp. And we want to do this for all of our requests. And so we have this function already defined for us here. We want to apply this everywhere within our server, so we're going to define it where we define our server. And it takes these three arguments: the request object, the response object, and next. So these two are pretty familiar. And the idea behind our middleware is that as a request comes into the Express server, it gets passed between various functions. We have certain types of middleware that we're very happy to use, which I'm actually going to apply right now. I'm going to use a middleware called express.json. And what this does is, as each one of our requests comes in, it's going to look at the request. It's going to see that it has some body that contains JSON stringified text, and then it will parse that into a JavaScript object for us and put that in the request object .body. And that's very convenient. And the way it works is exactly like how we're going to write our logger function. It's going to have access to the request object. It's going to have access to the response object, and then it's also going to have access to this next function, which determines whether or not we want this middleware to cause the next function in our chain of middleware to execute. So we can shield certain endpoints from actually running by never calling next within our middleware. Now, the logger doesn't want to do that. It just wants to log the things that it wants to log and then continue on down the chain of middleware functions. In the same way that express.json is going to parse this JSON, put it into the request object, and then pass it off to whoever wants to deal with that request next. So for our logger, we're going to need to console log some data. we want the request method, which I'm going to assume is it rec.method. I guess we will find out. What else do we want? The request URL. Let's try rec.url, and then we also want a timestamp. I will use date.now, even though that is not a very user-friendly timestamp. And now to apply this middleware, we need to use it. The problem is that these get applied in order, so it is really not helpful if I do server.use logger right down here. Because this express.json is applied before this get endpoint. So this middleware is going to see it before the get request. This middleware down here is not, and we can test that out. See? We don't get any console logs. This never ran. We would need to apply this middleware perhaps after our body has been parsed in case we want to console log some things there, but before we actually get to our endpoints. And now, when I send this request, we console log our three things. But notice the request never finishes now because we don't exit this middleware. We're never saying, all right, I'm done doing what I need to do. You can move on now. That's what we need this next function for. When I put this in and make the request, we'll see that we console log the requisite data, and then we immediately follow down the chain into our next bit of middleware, which turns out that's what this function for our endpoint is. As it's really just a piece of middleware, but it's not really middleware, it's endware. It's always going to be the end of the line for our request. But this is our global middleware that we apply directly to the server. Let's look at what we want to write next. What do I have open here? I don't know. So we're going to write our various API pieces inside of users and then apply middleware to that as well. So let's look inside of this users directory, and I'm going to open up the user DB as well as the user router, and I'll minimize my terminal just kind of right down to the bottom here, and we'll split these up to try to make this as readable as possible. So again, we have some scaffolding here. We need to add this require for the express. We have a router set up. We have the various requests that we're going to need to handle, and we're exporting it here. So let's go ahead and write some of these. I like to do my get requests first. So we have a function inside of our DB file called get. I imagine that's what we're going to use. So let's require this database file. Often we'll call it something like capital user when we're requiring the database functions for a specific resource, when we're writing the model for a specific resource. So that's what I'm going to use, and we want to import, what was this file called? user.db. So inside of my get here, I'm going to call user.get, which is going to take no arguments. Then I expect to receive an array of users objects, and then I am going to return status of 200 and have the JSON be the users array. I also want to put my catch on here. I'm going to get the error. I'm going to console log the error, and I'm going to return res.status of 500 and give it some error message. Error getting users. All right, and let's go ahead and hook this up. So in order to hook this up, I would need to go into my server.js. I would need to import the user router. And by import, I mean require, because we're in Node, and that's going to be in .users/userrouter.js. And now I'm going to apply this like a piece of middleware, which is exactly what this router is. We do server.use, we specify the route in which we want to apply this, which is going to be /API/users, and then we're going to put our user router in there. So now let's check and see if I can make this request. I'll duplicate this and say get users, and I'll make a request to API/users. And there we go. There we get our array of wonderful Lord of the Rings themed users. Okay. Let's see. Do I want to write out all of these endpoints before we get to the middleware? I think probably so. Because that'll show a good use case of when we want to refactor some implementation into middleware. So let's see. And validate user. Okay, I see. So let's go ahead and write our other requests here, and we'll kind of highlight the use cases for middleware as we get through. So I am going to go back to my user router, and now let's go ahead and get a user. So we're going to perform user.getById, and we're going to give it the ID that we're going to destructure out of our query params. So this is going to be rec.params, and I'm destructuring the ID. I will pass that to getById. Then I'm going to get my user. We can double check in here that we see this dot first, which means we're either going to return a user object when found or undefined, which is good. We don't have to do any of the fancy array destructuring. If we didn't understand how this function was written, we could just console log and figure it out for ourselves. Right? You should never be stuck on that, because you have all the tools you need to figure out, at least by playing around, what data you're expecting to receive from these functions. Alright, so in the case that I do have a user, I want to send a response back with a status code of 200 and the JSON being the user object. In the case that I do not have a user, I want to send back a status code of, what status code do we want? 404. And an error saying user with ID does not exist, or something hereabouts. So let's check and see if this works. I am going to duplicate this right here, change this to be get user, and now we're going to get our first user. And there we go. We get Frodo, and let's request a user that it does not exist. All right, awesome. So we're getting our errors. And this is a prime use case for our validate user ID middleware, because we're going to write these other functions that also need to rely on the fact that we are getting a specific user out of the database and that they exist. But I'm not going to write that middleware yet. I want to repeat myself first and then fix it, because I feel like that might be a little bit more instructive of cases where you're going to run into situations where you'll be like, oh, I could solve this more elegantly using middleware. So let's keep going. Let's what do we want to do? Let's you know what? Yeah, let's do that right now. Let's do that. So why don't we go ahead and write operations to edit this user, right? So in here, what I would want to do is I would want to destructure the ID from the query params, and then I would want to check and see if the user exists, and then perform the editing. Now, what we can do is, what I've done previously, is make use of the fact that we can aggressively try to perform an edit here. When we do the update function, it will return the number of records that have been updated. And we can use that to trigger our 404 or not, but editing a user might get a bit more involved with that at certain points. Here we have it a bit easy because the user record is pretty flat, and it maps well onto our database. But I might want to verify at some point in the future that the user exists before I even try the editing operation before I try to update. So I would do that by doing a user get by ID, and I would check to see that this user exists. Then, if the user exists, I would want to perform my editing stuff, but if the user does not exist, I would return res.status 404.json, and I would give it an error message that says something like, user with ID does not exist. And then inside of this successful case where the user does exist, I could go ahead and perform my update. I could do the user.update. I would need to give it the ID as well as the parameters that I've received from the user inside of the body that I want to update. And let's see what our user schema looks like from here. Looks like our user has a name, and that is it. So I will destructure the name from the body. I like doing the destructuring because it will allow me to avoid throwing errors when a client provides extra data that I don't need. Whereas if I just tried to insert rec.body into the database or update it and it contains keys and values that aren't found in our database, then our database would throw errors at us. So we're going to perform our update. Then we will get the number of rows updated, and for now I'm just going to return a 200 here and just return the number of rows updated, because I want to talk a bit about our middleware at this point. The idea is that we're performing some conditions here. In order to run the code that really does anything, this user update, we are conditionally checking to see if the user exists before we perform this operation. Now, when we use this kind of flow control, it's not easy for me to write this as a function because I need to run code. I can't, I could write a function called, verify, user ID that is going to take in an ID and then it's going to take in a callback function, and this is going to perform these actions and then run our callback inside of here in the case that we're successful. But relying on these kind of more complicated higher order functions is going to get a little bit difficult to reason about. And middleware is really wonderful because it allows me to apply this common set of logic before this endpoint is hit on any endpoints that I so choose. And it's a very, very good use case, not only for global middleware, like our log or some action we want to perform on all requests, but actions we want to perform on some requests, and actions that determine whether or not the request actually gets handled by our route. The idea is that we can write this function that handles this put to really only be concerned about put things. Using middleware, we can verify that everything is correct with the request coming in before it even gets here. And this can assume everything is right with the world. And that makes this function very easy to reason about, and we're able to offload some repeatable logic into our middleware functions. So instead of doing something like this, which I would call inside the put, I'm going to write some middleware, and I'm going to call that as a piece of middleware. So this is where we have our function validate user ID. And I got a little bit aggressive about deleting this because I actually want to pop it right down here. And the idea is that we can get the ID out of our rec.params.id, and we can check and see if this user exists. And in the case that the user exists, I want to go ahead and continue on to the next piece of middleware, whether that is another piece of middleware or our actual function designed to handle this request. But in the case that this user does not exist, I want to return 404. And I do not want to call next. I don't want to do that. I've already sent the response back, right? This put function doesn't need to run. This user doesn't exist. There's no point in continuing on, so I don't call next. We're allowed to, in our middleware, stop the chain wherever we feel like it. That's a lot of power. And now I can apply this to a route that needs it just by placing it in between the path that my handler is on, as well as the function that actually handles that request. So I can just apply my validate user ID function to this route by doing validate user ID. And now this will run as a piece of middleware, literally in between this function and previous pieces of middleware. And it allows me to greatly simplify this logic. Now, all I need to do is perform my update, because I can assume that the user already exists, right? I can make that assumption. And while we're at it, middleware is a great place to update our request object. So when we use the express.json middleware, right, the idea is that it parses the raw body that the user had sent to us, which is just text, into a JavaScript object, and it places that in rec.body. In this case, we don't have that, but we are acquiring this user object. So if we want to, as a point of convenience to avoid having to make this request again to the database, we can add our user to the request object inside of a key of our own choosing. I'm going to do rec.user. I'm going to set that equal to our user object. So now we have access to the user object. And so I can also apply this middleware to my get. I can put my validate user ID right here. And now look at how simple this code gets. res.status.200 JSON request.user. All of this can go away, because I don't even have to worry about the negative case. I don't have to worry about the case where the user doesn't exist. By the time my request gets to here, I can assume that everything is right in the world and that my middleware has taken care of any of that validation. My middleware has also been kind enough to place the user inside that request object for me, so all I have to do is send that back. So simple. And I get to reuse that object, reuse that functionality wherever I would like, inside of my update as well. Now, let's first check and see that I haven't broken anything, which I very well may have. Let's check and see. Oh, I'm getting some errors here. What did I do that it doesn't like? Undefined bindings detected when compiling first query. Select users from. Did I forget to pass the ID to? No, I did. Oh, I'm destructuring ID from not an object. Well, that's an oops on my part. Now let's check. Okay, so we make the request to this user, and that works just fine. I make a request to one that doesn't exist. We get this 404 error. That's the same as it was before, but I can put a console log in here. And we can see that we never actually reach that function. We never reach this router.get in the case where a user doesn't exist, because that's caught by our middleware. But if I go ahead and get Frodo, we see our get user console log. So middleware is wonderful. And I'm doing the same thing with the middleware in order to prevent the put from running when we don't have a valid user. Now, this is a case I won't make use of the user object on the request object, and I don't have to. We don't use rec.body on all of our endpoints either. In this case, I'm going to do the standard stuff. I'm going to verify that we have updated something. So then if we have updated, then I'm going to have to go out and fetch our updated user. So we're going to have to repeat this user.getBy ID. That's going to be the ID. Then we're going to go ahead and get the user, and we're going to return our res.status code of 200 and send our response of that user object. I'm also going to put a catch on here. In the case, I don't know why I decided to one-line this. We're going to catch an error, and if there is an error, we will console.log the error, and then we will send back a, oh, I'm all over the place, status code 500 JSON with an error message in it of error getting user. And we also want a catch on our update. So I will catch this error. I will console.log the error, and I will send back a 500 and say error updating user. And now let's test and see if all of this works. I will duplicate this. I will change this to update user. I'm going to make this a put request. I'm going to add a JSON body, and we'll update our name to be Froldo bags. Now let's see if this works. There we go. We get Florido bags. All right, and let's try this on a user that doesn't exist. We get our generic 404, which is not found anywhere inside of our rendered output. It's being handled by our middleware for us. It's great. Now, I could avoid having to get this again by recognizing that the only thing that's going to update is that name. So I can go ahead and just use the user I already have on my rec.body and kind of return an updated one myself. So I could do something like res.status and then spread in rec.body and then add the updated name. But I don't really want to do this personally because I don't know what the database is doing with what I've given it. We saw on other days there were these dynamically created and updated fields on our objects, as well as like what if the insert function does something like change the capitalization of the name or anything like that. So I'm just not gonna muck around with that, and I'm just gonna do my extra request here, and it's not gonna be a big deal. We can then very simply write the use case for our delete. I can add my validate user ID middleware here, and I can get my ID from my rec.params. And in fact, if we want to use the integer ID, we could also get the ID from our rec.user, right? Because the user is going to have the ID. So let's do that here, just to confuse people who aren't paying attention. So we have the ID here, and now we are going to call user.remove. We're going to give it the ID. We know that the user exists, so I don't really need to double check that that happened. So I actually don't need to accept any argument here. Yeah, and I'm not going to do that here as well, because right now I don't have an else statement, so it's possible for that request to not terminate. So we'll just assume that that is successful. And we've crashed because I didn't finish writing this function. So once we've finished removing, I'm going to return a status code of 204, which is successful. I have no data for you. I'm going to end that request. And then I am going to put my catch in here. I'm going to get my error. I am going to console.log my error. I'm going to send back my 500 status code. I goofed up with some error message that says error deleting user. Right? This gets a lot simpler when we can offload some of our validation logic into our middleware. And so we can do the delete. We send this delete request here. We get our 404 from the middleware. We see that our logger is working. That's wonderful. Now let's try to delete the 5th user. I don't even know who that is, but they're gone. They're out of here. Beautiful. Okay. So we've deleted the user, we've updated the user, we've gotten the user, and we have written some nice middleware to enable us to do that a bit cleaner. We can also go ahead and get the user's posts. Again, we'll validate that the user exists. This is a really nice use case for this. We saw this issue in yesterday's project where we were getting comments on posts, and we could try to do the thing where, oh, if there are no comments, then we say the post doesn't exist. Well, it turns out, you know, a post could just not be popular and it would have no comments, same as a post that doesn't exist. So we have to kind of make this request to verify the post exists, and it gets a little complicated and it kind of nests our code outwards, but we just do that in our middleware, right? And this doesn't have to worry about that. This can assume that the user exists, and that's very nice for us. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get my ID, and I will get it off of the request.params, again, just to confuse people not paying attention. And we'll see what function they gave us for this case. Get user posts, it looks like. So get user posts is going to take in my user ID. So I'm going to call user.get user posts, going to give it that ID. I lost my parentheses. Then when this is successful, I should receive an array full of posts. And I don't even need the fancy curly braces there, because I can just implicitly do res.status of 200, and we're going to give it the JSON of those posts. I can catch this, grab my error, console log my error. It makes me sad when I see people asking for help in the help channel, but not console logging their errors and telling us what is going wrong. So please do that. All right, and now we can duplicate this, get user posts, and let's check out Frodo's post. I wish this ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. Oh boy, I really like these Lord of the Rings examples. I feel like every instructor has their own nerd property that themes some of the assignments. I know Dustin's is Harry Potter, but I really like the Lord of the Rings ones. Oh, get off the road quick. Such a classic. Okay, so that works, and let's try to get a user that doesn't exist. We get our 404 handled by our middleware, right? We don't have to keep rewriting this logic or keep calling specific functions. We just add this as middleware, and all is right in our world. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So, what do we have to do next? Well, it looks like we have 2 more middleware functions left to write: validate user and validate post. Let's go ahead and write the endpoints that are going to require this middleware and see why it's a good idea to write this middleware instead. So, let's go ahead and add a new user. So I believe all we need there is the name. So I'm going to grab our name out of our request body. I am going to call user.insert, most likely. Yep, that looks like it. I'm going to give it the user object, which contains the name. Then I am going to, let's see, then it returns, oh, that's so nice. Look at this. Look at this. They already included the code to go ahead and get the user after it's inserted for us. This is another great use case to offload similar code, right? When I perform my update, which I've done here, right? I really just want to go out and get the user. I don't really care about what's been updated. We can offload this here inside of our database model function rather than inside of our endpoint. So another great way to avoid having to repeat ourselves. So when I post, I'm just going to get this user object, and then I'm going to do res.status 201, which means we've created our thing, and I'm going to return that user. I also want my catch the error, console.log the error, and res.status 500.json, our error message of error inserting user. All right, awesome. So let's test and see if this works. We will duplicate this. We will add user, make this a put. We'll put the user endpoint, and we'll add Samuel Gage. Perfect. All right, that works. Now, let's add a user with a name of 2. Okay, that kind of works. What if we add a user that doesn't have a name? Okay, now we hit a 500 because our database is yelling at us because we don't have a name. We probably want to add some kind of validation whenever we receive input from the user. We just don't want to take what they've given us and slap it into our database. We want to check and see that it fits whatever requirements that we have. We usually want to check that certain things exist, if they have the correct data type, if our strings meet some minimum or maximum length requirement. This is really on you as the backend dev to determine what the correct shape and value of our data is. So I can write this in here like we've done the other times, right? If name doesn't exist, then I'm going to use my return to do an early exit, and I am going to do res.status 400, right? Client messed up. Give it a JSON and say our error message is name required. Right. So now when I try to do this, hey, now we get this. Okay, well, I'm going to do some more of these. I'm also going to check if type of name does not equal string, then I'm going to say name must be string. Right, and so if I try to do my name being a 2 again, oh, we get this here. And you can see I can continue to add lots and lots of these cases where the validation fails in various ways, and there's some systems that exist that will allow me to do this in a slightly more robust manner than if statements. Kind of like we learned with Informic to do this kind of really expressive building of a schema that determines our validation. But at the end of the day, what we're doing here is we're checking to see if this data meets certain qualifications, and if it does, we're shortcutting our endpoint function, right? This early return that I'm doing here is I'm saying, all right, I don't actually want to handle the positive use case, right? I don't want to do this part. And that's exactly what we do with this kind of conditional middleware that we had when validating the user IDs. And chances are I'm going to want to use this in more than one place. So why not pop it out into a middleware? Let's just have our post function just handle the post when it's successful. All right, so I'm going to jump to the bottom of the file. I'm going to put this inside of my validate user, and then I am going to call next in the case where none of our validation if statements succeed. Now, notice that I have this return in here. Again, this return is causing an early exit from the function, which allows me to place this next out here. I only want to run this next if I haven't sent back a 400 error message. Instead of using these returns, I could, do kind of the if-else chaining, right? And this would be pretty much functionally equivalent. What I don't want is this, where I perform these if statements, I send back a response, and then I move on to the function that's going to try to send back another response. That's going to get me errors about setting headers. I'm going to keep my early return style because I like it. And so now we see that when I try to do these things wrong, I haven't applied my middleware yet. This is the on-submit equivalent for the node portion, is me writing middleware and forgetting to apply it. So here I'm going to add the validate user middleware. And so now when I try to do this, name is not defined. What did I do? I forgot to get the name from our request body. There we go. Name must be a string. We can also do nice things to the request body, right? I was discussing the case where we want to discard any invalid data here. We can go ahead and modify this. I can set the request body to be equal to an object that just contains the name. I can discard any unneeded data. And now I don't have to worry about that here. I can just set user equal to the request.body. And now I can insert the user. And this function can be none the wiser about the negative cases. Right now I can add other fields like test, and I'll set this equal to should do bad things. And let's give ourselves a valid name of Hank Borelvins. Big into the L's today. And now when I send the request, it succeeds because this test is essentially masked from my post. If I go ahead and remove this logic here, we'll see that this introduces an error. We get an error when inserting the user, and if we check our console log, we'll see that it's because our table doesn't have a column test. It cannot accept this erroneous data that I passed along with it. So another neat thing we can do with our middleware. All right, so the last thing we need to do for MVP is handle posts. Adding posts and validating that. So let's find the function we have not written yet, and this is for adding the post to the user. Let's see. I don't think they gave us a function to do that in here. I think we might have to take a trip over to the posts DB and then use their insert function. So I'm going to jump to the top of my file. I'm going to import post. I'm going to require / postdb.js. And I can use that function. So let's see. We're going to want to write our middleware to validate the post. If the body is missing, cancel the request. If the body is missing the required text field. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and write it all within here, and then we'll split it out into our middleware. So I'm going to go ahead and get the ID as the post ID from our rec.params. I am also going to get my text and Do I expect any other data for this? Posts have text. Oh, it's user ID, not post ID. What am I doing? This should be the user ID, right? That's what this is. I can also change this to be user ID if I wanted to in here. I'm going to leave it this way because it's good to see the different styles. And then we just want that text. So that's going to come in from the request.body. I would do my validation. You know, if not text, then I'm going to do my early return with the res.status 400 JSON with an error message of, you know, post requires text. I will repeat this for my other set of validation. What do they want us to do? If body is missing, okay, we want to check this first. If there is no request body, then you know, post requires body. And there are two use cases, and now we can handle our positive result where we'll do post.insert, and we will supply it an object which contains the user ID as well as the text. In the case that this is successful, let's see what insert is returning for us. Oh, very kindly, it returns the newly added post. Here, I am going to call res.status of 200, 201 actually. We've just created something, and return the post as our JSON. Wanna add a .catch here as well. Grab my error, console.log my error, and then res.status 500 with an error message of error adding post. All right, and so this is our completed route, but again, it contains this information somewhat outside of its purview for this validation that's going on. As well as we kind of have to contain this logic with adding the user ID into the post stuff. This is all things we can handle in our middleware. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. I'm going to grab all of this, and I'm going to take it down into this validate post. And again, what we want to do is we want to verify that our post request is correct. And then what I'm also going to do is, this isn't in the instructions, but we might as well, we can modify the request body to be equal to that post just the way we expect to receive it. We can add the user ID, we can have the text, we can discard any data that we don't need, and then I can call next. And now, with the post correctly formatted, everything is good, we've verified that it exists. We only have to handle this very, very positive use case when adding this post. I can say the post is equal to the request body, and now I can insert that post and be reasonably assured that everything is going to go well. So let's try this. We'll duplicate here. We'll add user post. This will be a post request. We'll add a body. We are going to need to give it a field called text, which I always want to write as test. This is a test post. And let's go ahead and see if this works. Error adding post. So you want to know why we got this error? Well, it turns out while we were trying to validate the whole post thing, we forgot about our user existing. Ugh, now I'm going to have to go back and write all of this code in order to verify that the user exists before I try to add posts to them. Ugh, isn't that going to be annoying? Well, what if I just have my validate user ID middleware on here? And also, the validate post middleware that I forgot to apply, because this really is the on-submit of the node world. So now I can without really even considering it, just very, very easily add in the existing code that I have to verify that the user exists before I perform any actions. And that's, again, very, very, very nice. So now when I send this post request, boom, validate user ID middleware hits. Gives me that 404. Now let's try to do it for a user that does exist. Bang! It works perfectly. And I can do my best to malform this. And that middleware is going to handle it for me. And we get this very tight, nicely contained function here for the post that doesn't have to worry about the extraneous bits. We've written the complicated stuff, the conditional stuff, inside of our middleware. Right, and that allows this code to appear very, very clean. And we also get these nice names, right? We don't just get these if statements and stuff hanging out, we get names. We get this documentation for free. In order to add a post, we have to validate the user ID, and we also have to validate the post coming in. And then we insert the post, right? This reads much clearer when we have well-named things, when we break apart our code into functions, when we name our functions well, we get better code as a result. Because these names help us reason about stuff. It helps us break our process down into logical, reusable chunks where we not only get the advantages of being dry, being able to reuse our logic, but these names tell a story about what our code is doing. It talks about intent in the way that merely writing procedural code does not. We're describing what we want the world to be like, rather than describing the process of ensuring that is the case. And that's a really huge benefit to doing things like this, to breaking our code down into different functions. All right, now let's see, did we hit MVP? We did our for custom middleware, we did all our CRUD operations on users, and we added endpoints to retrieve a list of posts for a user and to store a new post on user. Yep, and there we go. That is our MVP. Now for the stretch goals, we would do essentially the same thing for the posts router, which we can go ahead and take a look at. I'm not going to do that here just because that's a smidge of work that's going to look very, very similar to what we've already done. Right? We want to write validate post ID that's going to be essentially the same as validate user ID. We're going to perform our basic CRUD operations, which if you have time, absolutely do this, right? You want to get the reps in. You want to be able to do this until your eyes bleed, because it should feel like second nature, right? Typing this out, we should know where we're going before we get there, if you practice this enough. And then we can also create a React app front end. If you have time, I highly recommend this. I think you all would be shocked to see how much your React skills have already begun to atrophy, even though we've only taken like 5 days off of writing React applications. You'll be surprised the things that you've forgotten. So if you have time, spin up a quick one, just at least hit that GET request and then map over that data, right? Maybe render some cards, get everything going. And really make sure you don't lose any of those skills, because part of learning this backend is that we now get to understand the full stack, right? You can build the application front end to back, control the whole process. And that's really exciting. So make use of that. All right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to do this live and answer questions. If you do have questions, feel free to post them in the After Party channel underneath this video, and I will answer them as soon as I get back. So, thank you all so much, and I will see you tomorrow.